Now, the marine environment or the aquatic environment is very different than the terrestrial environment, and there's a couple of reasons why. One, you need light for most. We'll talk about an area, a specific circumstance where you don't need light, but basically the base of almost all food chains is light. And because the ocean is the way it is, there are some places in the ocean that don't get light, right? That would be, and if they don't have light, you're not going to have photosynthesis. So, there's that difference. The fact that you're living in water and not, on a terrestrial, some sort of terrestrial thing, you've got to talk about how to, surviving in water. And food chains can also be a little longer in aquatic environments than they can be on land. So if you have really shallow water, your primary producers will need protection from too much light. And then in very deep water, primary producers are going to need extra pigments to try and gather some light. So, you can't have too much of a good thing, and you can't have too much light. So secondary productivity. So primary productivity are plants, things that get their energy from the sun in 99% of ecosystems, terrestrial or aquatic. And then secondary productivity are the consumers, the things that eat the plants or eat the other consumers. We call that secondary productivity. So they are like the biomass of, animals, usually, and things that don't make their own food. So, for example, here's a marine food chain. For example, they can be a lot longer because you can have, little tiny plankton and then bigger plankton and then even bigger plankton and then very small fish and then big fish and then even bigger fish. So you're going to have, they're less efficient, but there's like so much plankton in the environment that you can have a longer food chain because there's remember that 10% rule, right? 10% gets transferred to the next, so if you've got, like 1 million kilograms of biomass, here you'd have, like 100,000. Here you'd have 10,000. Here you'd have 1,000, 100, 10. Okay, so because there's so much plankton, you can have those higher food chains. Where here, you'd have so much grass to eat, right, to transfer to the cow, or so much energy for the cow to, sometimes you can have one more level in terrestrial ecosystems, but it's, you're not going to have such a long food chain like you could in the marine environment. So now let's talk about the different biomes. And the reason we're going to talk about these different biomes is because there's different things we need to think of in order to be to think about the sustainability of these ecosystems. And I feel like a lot of times students have a little more experience with terrestrial biomes because that's what they're more familiar with. So coral reefs are located around the equator, and they have very specific tolerances as far as light, nutrients, pH, temperature, all of those things. They have to be like perfect in order for corals to survive. So this is about where they usually hang out in the ecosystem. Okay, so a reef is basically just a hard underwater structure. Most of the time, they are made by critters in phylum Cnidaria. So like these are corals, but sometimes you can have hard calcareous algae. I don't know that I see any in this picture, but you can. And And basically they secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton, which makes them very hard. And then when they, so they'll kind of grow, right? And then they'll create that skeleton, and then they'll create some more skeleton, some more skeleton. And so they kind of grow that way. But in order to do that, or if you have a table coral, they might go like this, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. But in order to do that, it takes a very long time. So it's not like it's going to happen overnight. It takes years and years and years. They grow like centimeters, fractions of centimeters a year. It's very small. The most important order is Sascartinia, which isn't super important for you guys. This presentation is kind of adapted from a marine ecology class, so this part is not as important to you. Then we have something called an estuary, and this is where sometimes they call them wetlands or brackish water. This is where fresh and ocean water meet, and so you've got a variety of salinities in that middle where the fresh and the salt are mixing. A lot of times people call that brackish water. Fresh water is much lighter than seawater. It doesn't have as many minerals and things in it. So when they meet, if you've got like fresh water coming in here and salt water coming in here, a lot of times the salt water will kind of go under and the fresh water will go above, and you'll get this thing they call a halocline. Where you're, that transition, and then this is mixed, and the degree to which it's mixed has to do with tides or how windy it is. So if it's more windy, you have lots of tidal energy, it's going to be mixed better than if it's not super windy and it's really a really calm bay or something like that. Then the more freshwater you have, the more mixing you're going to have. If you have a large estuary, it's more likely to mix. You've got more space for wind and tides and things like that. If it's a very small estuary, you're not going to have as much mixing because there's not going to be as much space. So these estuaries have something called submerged aquatic vegetation. They are plants that are completely underwater, and you can have this in the ocean or lakes, ponds, rivers, things like that. And then you can have emergent aquatic vegetation. These are places where, these are plants where some sort of the photosynthetic part is out at low tide. So if you've ever driven by like a marsh or something, or even been in a marsh, the salt marsh grasses would be called emergent because they come out during low tide, or like a mangrove. Those count at low, or all the time actually. So what is the importance of a salt marsh? And this is important for environmental science, this part. So we kind of did the background in order to get to this part. Salt marshes will slow waves. So they will increase the deposition of sediment, and they serve as a protective barrier to land erosion. So the more waves you have, the more erosion you're going to have. So, like a calm estuary, salt marsh kind of area is going to have a lot less erosion than a really rough kind of area that doesn't have that marsh as a protector. So that's important for folks that live near the land, near the coast, because a lot of times their houses are close to the ocean, and the less erosion the better for them. Another thing that it can do is it can slow floodwater from the land. So if the land is flooding, it'll kind of flood into that estuary or that salt marsh, and it'll slowly make its way to the ocean. It's not going to be like a huge just flow into the ocean. It'll also filter water from the land. So a lot of times there's a lot of filter feeding organisms. Salt marshes tend to have lots of oysters and clams and things like that. And they are really good at filtering water. So they'll remove a lot of the nutrients from the land. So they'll kind of protect the ocean from a lot of that nutrient-rich runoff. Like, for example, usually nitrogen and phosphorus from like fertilizers and things like that. So that's super important. And then not only do they do all these like kind of secondary things, but they are habitats, really good habitats in their own right. And so they produce a lot of plants. They are usually a very, what they consider like a nursery for fish. And a lot of the fish that are basically babies in salt marshes grow up to be commercially important fish. For example, crab, you're going to have a lot of blue crab in the salt marsh, you know, that people like to eat that. You could have baby grouper or baby snapper, things like that. They might live in a salt marsh, and they're gonna grow up to be things that, you know, people like to make their living on. So if you don't have that salt marsh, not only are you're reducing those secondary things like filtering water from the land or slowing flooding or slowing erosion, but you're also eliminating that habitat for the babies of those species that, you know, we like. Mangroves, this is a picture I drew, sorry, it's kind of bad, but I wanted to show all 3 mangroves in one picture, and that doesn't happen a lot. So a red mangrove is the kind with the prop roots. A black mangrove has those little like finger-like roots, and a white mangrove is usually above the high tide. All 3 of these plants are adapted to salt water, so they can handle salt water pretty well. And so they are important coastal trees. If you remember, plants and vegetation can help with sedimentation, reduce erosion. So a mangrove area, you know, it's just like it's a different type of wetland, like instead of like a marsh. So they're doing the same things where they're gonna, you know, reduce wave action. There's not gonna be a lot of wave action near mangroves. You're not gonna have a lot of erosion near mangroves. They're great habitats for baby fish. Baby fish love to live in these little crop roots like this. And these are kind of tropical to subtropical. So you're not going to see them, you know, up here. You'd see them more like Florida, that kind of area. And also, it's also in very nutrient-rich water. It's in the coast. So like one of the problems they have with mangroves areas, for example, is they like to make shrimp farms near mangroves, which mangroves, they're not super hardy plants. They grow really well where they grow really well, but they don't grow back very well. And so, you know, if you cut them down or you have that shrimp farm that's releasing all this extra nutrients, and basically like nutrient pollution, the mangrove swamp, a lot of times the mangroves will die, or they'll just cut them down to get to that place, and then they don't grow back very well. So this is an example of a red mangrove. You can see those prop roots right there. And this is, again, just what I was telling you earlier. So now we can talk about seagrass ecosystems. These are important because there's not a lot of true saltwater plants. We have a lot of saltwater algae. We have a lot of plants that can tolerate salt water, but we don't have a lot of true saltwater plants. And seagrass are one of the main true plants that live in salt water. So they're very important. And they're also, they're very, because they're colonial, like they're all kind of interconnected underground, it's very easy for them to kind of die out. And if you've ever been to the Keys, a lot of times people will drive their boats in places that are too shallow for their boat, and they'll like rip these huge gashes in the grass, and it's very difficult for that to grow back. You'll see those gashes all over the salt seagrass beds, and they're, you know, you'll see them for years and years because they take a long time to grow back. They need very shallow water because, you know, they do need light, but they do have a wide salinity tolerance, so they can tolerate low salt water to very high salt water. Some important things with the seagrass ecosystems. Seagrasses have a lot of primary productivity, right? They're plants, so they're producing a lot of oxygen in the water, but they also have little critters and little algae things that kind of live on them. They call those epiphytes, and those also add to the food chain. Seagrass can be consumed directly, by things. Manatees will eat seagrass, or they can become part of the detritus food chain when they die. Detritivores will eat them, and planktivores, on and on and on. They can alter sediment and water clarity. They can really, you've got grass here again. You've got plants. Plants stabilize the sediment, so their roots are going to stabilize the sediment and reduce erosion. The blades of this grass, because there's so many of them, they actually reduce water current, so they keep the area kind of still, a little more still than it would be. And so any sediments that would fall, be carried by the current, would kind of fall out of the water column and be deposited there, so you'll have actually additional sediments instead of less. And then they create structure underwater, which is important for baby baby fish and things. Like, it's almost like a nursery too for a lot of organisms. So then we have a beach. A beach is going to be basically determined by the wave energy. A high energy beach is going to stay sandy. That would be a beach that has lots and lots of wave action. But a low energy beach might be more muddy and not as sandy. And then you can have there can be sometimes like seagrasses and other things growing in the ocean near the beach. So these sand, mud ecosystems, beach type of ecosystems, are important habitat for critters that live in the mud. Infaunal means they live in the sand or the mud. It can be a minor fishery. There are, things that live in the sand that they that fishermen might like to catch. You can think, like, a lot of times they sell sand dollars, right? People will catch those. And then it's a place where sediment is continually moving around and regenerating. Tybee is a beach in off of Savannah, and it's kind of an interesting beach because if you look at pictures of it throughout the years, you'll see that it's constantly changing shape. The North Beach will be a little bigger, and then the South Beach will be a little bigger, and it just is constantly changing shape with currents and where sand is being deposited and where it's being moved from. And so it's those sandy areas, those ones that are based on basically sediments, they're going to change a lot. Then we have kelp beds. These are more prevalent in temperate regions. They're very common, like off the coast of California. They need shallow, like, for example, seagrass was less than 5 meters, right? Shallow water. So this is less than 50 meters, which is still 150 feet deep, which is still, to me, kind of deep, but it's considered shallow because you need that abundant sunlight for these guys, the kelp, to live on. Kelp are actually algae, even though they're really, really big and they look like plants. People think that they're plants because they're just so big, but they actually don't have real roots. They live on rocks, and then they have like pseudo roots, and they kind of grip onto the rock, and then the kelp grows, and it has these little air bubble kind of things, and they're filled with CO2, which makes them buoyant. And then then they have their whatever, the kelp, that the fronds or whatever that are coming off of them. But that's kind of how a kelp would look. And so what they do is they have then you have all these rocks, you've got all the kelp, so they grow kind of up like this. They all have these, and they end up calling it like a kelp forest because there's so many of them. It almost looks like a forest because you've got these basically tall underwater trees in the kelp, and so it kind of looks like a forest. And critters live down here. They live up, on the kelp, up the kelp. They'll, you've got lots of fish. They'll swim. It's a really vibrant habitat. In a kelp ecosystem, sea urchins are dominant. You may have heard about where we talk about like keystone predators. A lot of times they talk about sea urchins and sea otters. The sea otters were hunted for their pelts, and the sea otters will actually they'll either eat the sea urchins, and so if they do that, the sea urchins actually will eat the kelp, and if the sea urchins get out of control, they'll actually destroy the kelp ecosystem, which would mean that then the whole entire ecosystem collapses because the sea urchins have eaten all of the kelp. And so a lot of times they'll consider the sea urchins or the sea otters keystone predators because, for example, you take out the sea otter and then the entire ecosystem can collapse because the sea urchins are then destroying the environment. So it's kind of an interesting discussion. A lot of times they'll talk about kelp ecosystems when they talk about keystone predators. Kelp beds have a lot of primary productivity, and they're this great shelter, again, like a nursery for big fish. The deep sea is the largest single habitat because, again, it takes up the most surface area. It's at the very bottom of the ocean. There is no light, or 98% of it has no light. And this is basically that one exception that I was telling you about to the whole needing sunlight rule. This is a hydrothermal vent, and they'll actually the base of their ecosystem is not something that's photosynthetic, but chemosynthetic, and they usually eat hydrogen sulfide and then basically do almost a type of photosynthesis with hydrogen sulfide. And so they are the base of that ecosystem. A big problem with this area is low temperature. I want to say that it hovers around 4 degrees Celsius all the time, which is pretty cold. It's very, very lots of pressure. So as a critter, you've got to be able to withstand that pressure, and there's no light. Okay, so the food that you can eat is something called marine snow, which is basically like, the way I like to explain it is it's basically like the fingernail clippings of the ocean. It's all of that like shed skin and like nasty, like fingernail clippings, like shed skin and fingernail clippings. I mean, animals don't clip their fingernails, but that kind of thing. Kind of like flow down in the ocean, and you can see it kind of here. These white bits. That's marine snow, and that's basically the ocean equivalent of fingernail clippings and like dead skin. And they can eat that. They can eat the remains of like whales and big giant dead things that fall to the ground in the ocean, or they can. Those are those chemosynthetic organisms, those organisms that actually produce their own food from inorganic compounds like hydrogen sulfide. This is an example of a hydrothermal vent. They're often located along tectonic plates, or that ring of fire that we'll talk about in the plate tectonics unit. And the main critters here are these little lamps you'll have, and then these red things are worms actually, and they have a bacteria that lives in them that is red, and that's what does the chemosynthesis for them. So again, and what's weird about these is the bottom of the ocean is usually very cold, right? Like around 4 degrees Celsius. Here it's very, very hot. Okay, this is like steam and stuff coming from like basically like magma, or the core of the earth. They're active environments. They're very, very busy, but they're ephemeral. What that means is they could be busy for a few months or a few years and then just like disappear. And then like the hydrothermal vent will die. These will basically like stop producing. And when they stop producing, everyone else around there dies. And then another hydrothermal vent will open up somewhere else, and critters will start appearing there. They are chemoautotrophic, so they are like basically the only ecosystem on Earth that is not driven by photosynthesis. They're driven by these chemosynthetic organisms. And they have a lot of endemic animals, so things that only live at hydrothermal vents. That's just the only place they live, and they don't live anywhere else on the planet, so that's kind of cool and interesting. Then we have something called a cold seep, which is also interesting. It's kind of the opposite of a hydrothermal vent. It's still at the bottom of the ocean, but instead it's going to be cold, right? Ambient temperature, so like 4 degrees Celsius. You're still going to be having that hydrogen sulfide and methane, but instead you've got like this these cold seeps. You've got that coming out of the environment of the core or the mantle instead of the hydrothermal vent. These are also places where we'll find a lot of crude oil. So not only do we have these super endemic, very unique ecosystems, but it's also a place where where oil is found, and so we like to drill for oil. So then it can really, disrupt these environments. Because example, here's the oil reservoir. Now you've got a big oil rig. You can see how that would kind of affect the environment a little bit. And then if you have an oil spill, then you've got major problems. So a cold seep is going to be cold. They're very calm and stable, so not like the hydrothermal vents that are like really fast growing and really ephemeral. These are they stay this way all the time. These are like clams or mussels right here. What's interesting about these cold seeps sometimes is you'll go up to them in the ocean and you're underwater, but you see something that looks like a pond underwater, and it's like, wait a second, I'm already underwater. What is this? And that's basically sometimes the part of the cold seep. Again, it's driven by it's not driven by photosynthesis because it's so deep. These are slow growing, long-lived. They might be long-loved, I don't know, but they are definitely long-lived. And there's high biomass of endemic and non-endemic animals. But again, if you've got this oil well that comes in here, kind of digs down, it's really gonna upset that very calm, stable environment. So now we've talked about these different environments. Now let's talk about fisheries. So fisheries are not only are fisheries collecting fish, but they also involve if you're catching clams or oysters or crabs. For example, you could have a blue crab fishery or a clam fishery or an oyster fishery. So you don't have to be a fish to be a fishery. So it's kind of anything that comes from the ocean, we call it a fishery. Now, fish are used for a variety of things. We use different cultures and religions use fish. For example, Catholics eat fish on Fridays. That's tradition in the Catholic religion is to eat fish on Fridays. In Japan, this is a shark fin soup. Shark fin soup at your wedding is supposed to be like very good luck. It's very important to have shark fin soup at your wedding. This is one of the main reasons we're in trouble with fish or sharks, is because people are basically they'll cut the fins off of the sharks and then put them back in the ocean, which they'll die. They can't swim without their fins, and they can't live if they're not swimming, and so they die just for the fins. We also use fish for animal feed. We can grind it up for animal feed other animals. We can use it for fertilizer. There are parts that we'll use for jewelry. Example, we use like pearls and buttons and coins. All of those have been from like shells or things like that. We use a lot of fishery things in industry. For example, fish oil. If you've ever taken like a fish oil pill, we use like the fat from the gills. Menhaden, which is a type of fish, was used as fertilizer and also to feed animals. So these are, there's a variety of uses for fish besides just humans eating them. Okay. So there's a couple ways we can catch fish. and some of them have benefits. There's pros and cons to all of them. So active ways to catch fish is a seine net or a toad net. So this is where, for example, let me try and draw a picture where you'd have like a boat. I'm going to try my best to draw the picture. Okay, here's your boat, and then you've got this net, and this net kind of opens like this. This is the net part, and you drag it along the bottom of the ocean. And then anything in its path, critters, fish, corals, whatever, is collected up in that net. And then you pull it up in the boat, pour it out on the deck, and then you sort through what you want. So this is going to have a lot of bycatch. And bycatch is the term for like things that we catch that we don't want. So caught things in addition to target fishery. Okay, so you could have things like turtles in here, also all sorts of stuff, corals, and whatever you don't want usually just gets thrown over the side of the boat, and then those things usually end up dying. A toad net is kind of the same. You can have passive traps where you just leave, traps, at the bottom of the ocean. And animals swim into the traps, and then they can't get out. And then you come back to get your trap. A lot of times the traps will have like a buoy attached to them so you can find them. But if the buoy falls off, then or comes unattached, then you've got the trap at the bottom of the ocean that's not that's still collecting animals, but there's no one to catch to come get the trap. And so you can have like fish and turtles and all sorts of sharks, whatever, in there, and they can't get out and they'll die in there. You can have something called a long line. That's what's in this picture. It's basically a really, really, really long line with like a bunch of hooks at the end. And as fish swim by, they will get caught in the hooks. You can get sharks. This is marlin. This looks like maybe a tuna. You can get dolphins. You can get all sorts of stuff, turtles, caught in these long lines. And let's say this is a tuna fishery. All of the sharks will just get thrown overboard. The problem is if you've got like a dolphin or a turtle, when they get caught in this line, they're caught. And if they need to breathe air, they can't get to the surface, so they'll die while they're on the line. And then, once the boat reels in the line, you've got these dead dolphins and turtles and things like that on the lines, and you can't get them off. You can see they have these flags and things. If you have like a bird sees the fish down here, the bird may, go under the water to get the fish, get caught on the line, and again, the bird can't come out. And then they have something called a gill net. A gill net is here. And what this was is the fish would swim through it, and their gills would get caught in the net. And those have been outlawed. So they're all different types of things, and like they said, they have their pros and cons. Here's an example of a fishery collapse, and this happens over and over, but I'll just go through a couple examples with you. So the Pacific sardine fishery, we had a lot of fishing pressure in the 1920s, and then we had one of the first recorded El Nino events, which halted upwelling, upwelling brings, basically, if this is the ocean, upwelling brings nutrients from the bottom up to the top and circulates the ocean basically, so then it can support fish life. So if you don't have that upwelling, you're going to lose the fish in addition to them being caught. So there were less fish, recruiting, less fish living there, and then with this huge fishery pressure, basically it just collapses. There's not enough fish to support the fishermen that are going out, and it basically collapses because there's there's not enough fish to support all the fishermen. And this is, these are one of the reasons that there are regulations. Like, for example, you can only catch things on certain weekends or certain times of the year, or you can only catch a certain amount on your boat for the season or the day. They used to not have rules like that, and you could just take as much as you want, and they would take too much, and we ran out, and we had things like this collapses. So in order to maintain the fishery for all of the people, not only that want to eat those fish, but also the people that make their livelihood on that fishery, they had to put some rules in place. And so sometimes people get upset because they put rules like, oh, you can only get fish this size, or only fish this size, or oh, we can't even have a fishing season this year. But the reason they're doing that is they're using science to measure the population size and whether it can support a fishery, and they're trying to avoid these collapses. So one of the things we need to do when we talk about whether a fishery is sustainable, and this is also when we were talking about, for example, R or K selected species, or what makes a species more likely to go endangered, is we have to look at the life cycle of the animal. For example, animal that is going to be long-lived or slow reproducing, that's not going to be a good fishery. Okay, sharks and groupers, for example, the grouper, they don't have their babies till they're 25. Okay, that's not really a great fishery because it's going to be hard to reproduce that fishery or keep it sustainable. If you catch a grouper that's 20 or 23, it's been living for a really long time. It's been doing a really good job staying alive. But if you catch it at year 20, it hasn't had a chance to reproduce, and it will make no babies, right? And so that's a lot of times when they have like size limits on fish, just because typically a 25-year-old grouper is going to be around this size range, so you have to catch grouper that are bigger than that. Okay, and the reason they do that is because you can't go up to a fish and be like, "Hey, dude, how old are you?" Right? You have to you have to do it based on size, because a regular fisherman is not going to know how old a fish is, and so that's why they have like size requirements, for example, on fish. Short-lived species that have lots and lots of babies can be sustainable, but not always. So a blue crab is a fairly sustainable fishery. They have lots of babies. They're all over the place. But for example, I think I mentioned this in another session, but like scallops, scallops actually die after they have babies. And so once they've, laid their eggs or fertilized or whatever, released their gametes, they die. So there's this, in Florida, for example, there's a huge scallop fishery. I mean, they make tons of money off the scallop fishery, the tourism and everything. And so unfortunately, they have to have the scallop fishery, the season or whatever, scallop season, before they reproduce, because if they have it after they reproduce, people are only going to find dead scallops, and that is no fun for a scallop hunter. It is really fun to catch scallops. And so you want to catch alive scallops, not dead scallops, right? In order to use for food or whatever. And so they have a limit on how many scallops you can collect, but the fishery is before they reproduce. And so a lot of times what they've had to do is seed the area with scallops. So they'll like grow them in a lab or some sort of aquaculture facility, and then release them in the environment for that scallop season, because the scallops can't reproduce, can't maintain their population size, because they're being caught before they have a chance to have babies. Mariculture is kind of interesting. It's basically like aquaculture, like growing fish in like a farm, except it's an ocean farm, but it's doing it in the ocean. And so when I was talking about the shrimp fishery in the mangroves, that's like mariculture, because they're doing it in the ocean. So aquaculture is the act of like growing or farming aquatic organisms, and this can happen. You can have ponds like on a facility that are made just to grow those critters. You can have aquaculture facilities inside like a building where they have huge, places like fish runs for the fish to live. and grow, or you can actually grow them in the ocean. And one of the reasons they like to grow them in the ocean, for example, if you're a plankton, um, if you're something that eats plankton, then you don't have to feed them because they just get the, the moving water from the ocean. They just eat what's in there. The problem is they usually keep them at a higher density than they do in the outside environment. And so then you've got all of these fish that can't escape, all pooping in the same place, so they're getting a lot of, you're going to have disease here, you're going to have extra nutrients, all sorts of stuff. So it's bad for the environment, that stuff. And then a lot of times too, they'll give them antibiotics, which then, gets released to the environment because it isn't a closed system. The advantage of that, you don't have to feed them. Then you also have that problem where, they're there. The whatever you put in there can come out. If these fish, for example, lay eggs, the eggs can get through the net, and if they don't belong in that area, then you've released non-native fish. And so there's some issues with these kind of areas. Here's another fishery class, the Atlantic cod fishery. So this is on our side. They had, again, some intense fishing. In the 70s, the catch per unit effort declined, but total catch increased. So we had more fishing boats than we had previously. So each boat was less, but we're still catching more fish total. And then in the 1980s, okay, this is, right around here, they realized, some problems, right? We're catching more fish, but each boat is catching less. We are going to have some trouble. And then in the 90s, they had trouble with the recruitment. That means the babies surviving, and the fishery just collapsed. And it still hasn't gone back to its historical numbers. And so there's basically just not enough fish to support the fishermen, and the fishermen have to find new jobs, and that's all they've ever done. And a lot of times it's all they've done, and their parents have done, and their parents have done, and their parents have done. So it's all they've done for generations. These fishing communities then kind of like disappear, and it's so when they make the rules around fisheries, they do that to protect the people that make their livelihood from those fisheries, and so that fishery doesn't run out, and they don't have to go find new jobs all of a sudden or whatever. And then this happens over and over and over. You can see this is the California sardine fishery. Again, huge catches, and then bam, it just like drops off, right? Collapse. And you can see it's still low, low, low. Most fisheries have already collapsed or are in severe decline. So we're struggling with these. 90% of predatory species are gone. That's tuna, grouper, sharks, things like that. And the remaining large predators are smaller. So they show pictures, for example. You can look at pictures of like where the people are like standing there, holding their fish, that they caught. And like way long time ago, it was like, the fish they caught was like this. And then, now a huge fish, might be like this, or even smaller. So the total size of the fish is decreasing. Another interesting thing that's happening is fish are starting to reproduce at smaller sizes because there aren't any big ones. The population is starting to kind of adjust where like they're smaller at reproductive age, and so they're still not reproducing till they're like 20, but they're smaller when they get to 20, because that basically like keeps them alive. So that's kind of interesting. So anyway, this is a kind of a overview of aquatic ecosystems as like a background, and then how like fisheries and things like that are have been affected by humans in particular, and also how these aquatic or marine environments are helpful to us, right? like for example, remember we talked about the wetlands, how they reduced erosion and reduced pollution to the ocean and things like that. So anyway, that's a kind of an overview of aquatic ecosystems.